The diner wasn't much to look at. The wallpaper peeled, the coffee tasted burned, and the jukebox in the corner hadn't worked right in years. But for some reason, David Miller kept coming back. Tonight, he sat alone in the corner booth, stirring a cup he hadn't touched. He wasn't there for the food. He was there for the quiet, the kind you can't buy no matter how much money you have. Sarah moved quickly between the tables, balancing plates on one arm, coffee pot in the other. She was young, but already carried herself like someone who'd seen more than her share of hard years. When she reached his booth, she gave him a polite smile, the kind servers use to cover exhaustion. "Refill?" she asked. He nodded. The liquid poured in a steady stream until her gaze landed on his hand. She paused. A simple silver band glinted under the diner's fluorescent lights, ivy etched along the edges. "My mum had a ring just like that," she said before she could stop herself. The words hit David harder than she could know. His hand froze around the mug. He looked up slowly, searching her face. "What did you say?" Sarah touched the chain around her neck. From beneath her shirt she pulled out a ring, nearly identical, dangling against her palm. The same ivy pattern, the same worn edges. "She wore it every day," Sarah whispered, her voice softening. "It's the only thing I kept after she passed." The noise of the diner seemed to fade. David's chest tightened, a memory stirring just out of reach. He cleared his throat, steadying his voice. "What was her name?" "Linda," Sarah said simply. The name struck him like a jolt, but he didn't let it show, not yet. He forced a faint smile, sliding his cup closer. "It's a rare pattern," he said, "not something you see often." Sarah shrugged, slipping the chain back under her shirt. "Guess that makes it special." She moved on to the next table, but David stayed frozen in his seat, staring at the ring on his finger. The coffee had gone cold again, but he didn't notice. He had walked into Rosie's diner looking for silence. Instead, he had found a ghost he thought he'd buried long ago. And he knew he'd be back tomorrow. The next evening, Rosie's was busier. Truckers hunched over their plates, and a family of 4 squeezed into a booth by the window. David slipped quietly into his usual corner seat. He told himself it was just for the coffee, but the truth pressed heavier on him than the cup in his hands. Sarah noticed him right away. She carried the pot over, lips pressed into a line. "Back again?" she asked, not unkindly, but not quite welcoming either. "Guess I like the atmosphere," David said with a faint smile. She raised an eyebrow. "Nobody likes this atmosphere. Floors are sticky, coffee's burnt, boss yells if we're 2 minutes late." As if on cue, the manager barked an order from behind the counter, telling her to hurry with table 5. Sarah winced, muttered an apology, and turned to leave. But when she set the check down later, her eyes flicked once more to the ring on his hand. "You said last night it was rare," she said carefully. "How do you know?" David hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, but the words caught. "I've seen it before," he said finally. "A long time ago." Sarah studied him, suspicion flickering across her face. "You sure you're not just saying that because you saw mine? People like to make up stories for tips." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it stung all the same. "I don't need to make up stories," David said quietly. "And I'm not here for tips." For a beat, their eyes locked. Sarah looked away first, slipping the chain back under her shirt. "Well, whatever the story is, it's just a piece of metal to most people. To me, it's the last thing I have of her. That's all." She moved on to the next table, her smile returning for a family with 2 tired kids. But David sat back, staring at the worn ivy pattern circling his finger. He could still hear Sarah's words, clipped and defensive. People like to make up stories for tips. It was clear she didn't trust him, and maybe she had every reason not to. Still, as the manager scolded her again for moving too slow, David's chest tightened. The ring on his finger wasn't just metal, it was a promise, one he hadn't kept. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to try again. By the 3rd night, David was starting to feel less like a customer and more like a shadow in the corner booth. He kept to himself, but his eyes followed Sarah as she rushed between tables, juggling trays and coffee pots. She moved fast, but not fast enough for her boss. "Harper, you're dragging again!" the manager barked from behind the counter, not caring who heard. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. She just poured another refill, balanced another plate, kept her head down. When she reached David's table, he noticed her hands shaking slightly as she set the mug down. A folded envelope slipped from her apron and landed by his cup. He picked it up before she could. The bold red letters on the front made his stomach drop. Final notice, rent due. Sarah snatched it back, cheeks burning. That's private. David nodded, careful with his voice. Of course, I'm sorry. For a moment, the mask she wore for customers cracked. It's always something, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Rent, electric, hospital bills. You think you've put one fire out and another starts right up. She let out a bitter laugh, then caught herself. Forget it. You didn't come here to hear my problems. David wanted to say he'd heard those words before, from another Harper with the same determined eyes. He wanted to tell her that promises weren't meant to be forgotten. But Sarah was already pulling herself together, sliding the envelope back into her apron, forcing a tired smile. I'll manage, she said, though her voice trembled. Then the manager shouted again, telling her to stop chatting and get to table 4. Sarah flinched and hurried away, leaving David staring at the ivy ring on his finger. For the first time in years, he felt the old weight of it press into his skin. He had promised Linda once that he would help someone when it mattered. And now, sitting in that sticky-floored diner, watching her daughter carry the same burden, he wondered if the time had finally come. The dinner rush had passed, and the diner had gone quiet. A few truckers lingered over pie, the jukebox hummed in the background, and Sarah finally let herself breathe for a moment. She slid into the booth across from David, setting the coffee pot down with a soft thud. You know, she said, half teasing, half tired, most people don't come here 3 nights in a row. The coffee's not that good. David smiled faintly. I'm not here for the coffee. Her eyes narrowed just a little. Then what are you here for? He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the chain at her neck. That ring, he said quietly. It's not just any ring. I've seen it before, a long time ago. Sarah stiffened. You said that already. What's your point? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your mother, Linda. I knew her, years back. She helped me when I needed it most. She gave me this. He held up his hand, the silver band catching the dull diner light. Said it was a reminder, a promise. For a moment, Sarah froze. The words should have comforted her, but instead they lit a spark of anger. You knew her? She asked sharply. Then where were you when she was working double shifts just to keep the lights on? Where were you when she came home too tired to stand? If she saved your life, why didn't you show up when she needed saving? Her voice carried, enough for a few heads to turn. From behind the counter, the manager glared at her and barked, Harper, keep it down. Customers don't need to hear your drama. Sarah's face flushed. She pushed herself up from the booth, gripping the coffee pot so hard her knuckles whitened. You don't get to walk in here with your fancy coat and your big words about promises, she said, her voice low but fierce. Promises didn't keep her alive. Promises didn't pay our rent. David's chest tightened. He wanted to explain, to tell her how guilt had kept him silent, how he'd buried her mother's name because it hurt too much. But all he managed was a whisper. You're right. I failed her. I don't want to fail you. Sarah shook her head, blinking hard. You don't even know me. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him sitting alone, the weight of the ring heavy against his skin, and the space between them wider than ever. Snow pressed against the diner windows that night, a steady curtain of white. Sarah moved slower than usual, her smile stretched thin. When she slid David's coffee across the table, an envelope slipped from her apron pocket and landed face up on the formica surface. This time she didn't snatch it away. Maybe she was too tired to pretend. The bold red letters spoke for themselves. Eviction notice, 7 days. David's chest tightened. Sarah! She shook her head quickly, her voice brittle. Don't! I know what you're going to say. And no, I don't want your money. She tucked the envelope back into her apron, forcing a laugh that cracked halfway. I'll figure it out. I always do. Then the manager's voice cut across the diner. Harper, less talking, more tables. His glare lingered on David, as if the presence of a man in a tailored coat was somehow her fault. Sarah ducked her head and hurried off. David sat there, restless. He knew the pattern too well. Linda had worn the same weary mask, swearing she could manage until managing nearly broke her. He couldn't sit by again. The next morning, Sarah returned home from her shift to find workmen on ladders outside her apartment, hammering shingles into place. A new tarp stretched over the roof where water had leaked all winter. She stopped dead on the sidewalk, Emma's mittened hand clasped in hers. David stood by his car, watching. Her face drained of colour, then flushed hot. "You did this?" she demanded. "It was leaking," he said simply. "No child should sleep under a dripping ceiling." Her eyes blazed. "That's not the point. You don't get to swoop in and fix my life without asking me. You think this makes me grateful. It just makes me feel small." David held her gaze. "It makes you dry. It makes her safe," he said, nodding toward Emma. Sarah's voice trembled. "And what happens next time? You pay my rent, my groceries, then what? I owe you my dignity?" The words hit harder than the wind cutting through the street. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve, confused by the tension. Finally, Sarah turned, pulling her daughter close. "Don't come back to the diner tomorrow," she said quietly. "I can't keep doing this." She walked inside without another glance, the door slamming shut behind her. David stayed on the sidewalk as snow gathered on his shoulders, the ring heavy on his hand. For the first time since Linda pressed it into his palm, he wondered if keeping a promise could hurt more than breaking it. For days, David kept his distance. He drove past Rosie's more than once, the neon sign glowing in the snow, but he never went inside. Her words still echoed. "You think this makes me grateful? It just makes me feel small." He knew she was right. He had treated her struggle like a problem to solve, not a life she was fighting to hold together. Sarah, meanwhile, tried to convince herself she was better off without him. She scrubbed dishes, balanced trays, smiled at customers, but the eviction notice on her counter felt like a noose tightening with each passing day. Emma's laughter filled the apartment, but at night, when the girl was asleep, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the bills stacked in front of her. On the fifth night, her landlord came knocking. His words were blunt. "7 days left, Harper. After that, I need the unit. No sympathy, no room for bargaining, just business." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. When the door shut behind him, she sank into a chair, clutching the ring around her neck. "What am I supposed to do, Mum?" she whispered. That's when she saw the envelope on the floor. Slid under her door, her name written neatly across the front. Her pulse jumped. She tore it open, half afraid it was another notice. Instead, it was a letter. "Sarah," it read, "I owe you an apology. I tried to keep a promise the wrong way, by fixing instead of listening. Your mother once saved me. She asked me to help someone else when the time came, and for years I failed her. I thought helping meant money. I see now it means respect. If you want me gone, say the word and I will stay away. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try again, this time on your terms, not mine." Sarah read it twice, then a third time. Her hands trembled as she set it down on the counter. For the first time in weeks, she cried not from exhaustion or anger, but from the weight of being seen. "Mama!" Emma's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom. "Who was at the door?" Sarah wiped her cheeks and whispered, "Just someone who still remembers a promise." She pressed the ring against her chest and sat in the silence, the letter staring back at her. The choice was hers now. Send him away for good, or open the door to something she wasn't sure she could trust. The next morning, Sarah stood outside Rosie's, watching the snow melt into slush along the curb. Through the glass, she saw David sitting in his usual booth, a newspaper folded in front of him, coffee untouched. He wasn't scanning the room for her, wasn't restless. He just sat there quietly, as if waiting without expectation. She almost turned around. Pride urged her to walk back to her car, to keep her guard up, but her fingers brushed against the chain around her neck, the ring pressing warm against her skin. With a breath that shook more than she wanted, she pushed open the door and walked in. When she slid into the booth across from him, she didn't bother with small talk. "I read your letter," she said flatly. David met her eyes, calm. "And?" Sarah folded her arms. And I don't know what to make of it. You talk about promises, about respect, but you still feel like a stranger who shows up when he wants and disappears when it suits him. My mum had enough of those." Her words were sharp, but her voice cracked at the end. David nodded slowly, not arguing. "I deserve that." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a worn envelope on the table. "There's something else. I've carried this for years. I think it's yours." Sarah frowned. The paper was yellowed, fragile with age. Her breath caught when she saw the handwriting on the front. "It's my mum's," she whispered. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words inside were simple, but they hit like a storm. "If this finds you, it means my girl is old enough to carry the truth. I wasn't always strong enough to be the mother she deserved, but I want her to know she was never forgotten. One man carries a promise for me, not to save me, but to stand by her when the time comes. If she wears this ring, let it be her reminder that she was always loved." Tears blurred the ink. For years, Sarah had believed her mother's story ended in failure, in absence. Now, for the first time, she saw her mother had left something behind, not just pain, but hope. Still, she couldn't let go of her fear so easily. She folded the letter carefully and looked at David, her face wet but steady. "Words are one thing, living them is another. Why should I believe you'll do any different than before?" David leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Because this time, I'm not running from the promise, and because you get to decide how I keep it." Sarah stared at him, torn. Part of her wanted to push him away again, but another part, the part that heard her mother's voice in every line of that letter, wanted to believe. She tucked the envelope close to her chest, swallowing hard. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. David gave a faint smile. "Then we figure it out together." Sarah didn't smile back, not yet. But she didn't walk away either. The eviction date came faster than Sarah could breathe. Boxes stacked up in the corner of her apartment, each one taped shut with the weight of surrender. Emma played with her crayons on the floor, asking innocent questions about why her bed was being taken apart. Sarah forced a smile, but inside she felt like the ground was crumbling. When she walked into Rosie's that morning, her eyes were swollen from a night without sleep. The manager gave her a sharp look. "Harper, you'd better not drag today. We're short-staffed." She bit her tongue, tied her apron and moved between tables. But when she reached David's booth, her exhaustion cracked through. She set his coffee down too hard, spilling a little. "Sarah?" His voice was gentle. "Talk to me." She let out a bitter laugh. "Talk about what? That my daughter and I have 6 days before we're out on the street? That I work double shifts pouring bad coffee and it still isn't enough?" She shook her head, blinking back tears. "What's the point? Words won't change a thing." David studied her quietly. He could have pulled out his wallet then and there, but Linda's words haunted him. Not charity, a chance. He leaned forward. "What if it isn't about words? What if it's about building something that lasts?" Sarah frowned. "You think I haven't tried? Every shift, every dollar stretched till it breaks. There's nothing left to build with." "There is," David said. He pulled the worn notebook from his coat and slid it across the table. "Your mother had a dream. She called it Linda's place. Not a handout, a corner where people could help each other, a place with dignity." Sarah hesitated, running her fingers over the faded sketches inside. Shelves of bread, a bulletin board with job postings, a jar for pay-it-forward coffee. Her mother's handwriting whispered from the pages, stubborn and hopeful all at once. Her throat tightened. "She used to talk about this. I thought it was just something she said to make the world seem less cruel." "It doesn't have to stay a dream," David said softly. "We can try, not for her, for you, for Emma." Sarah stared at him, torn in two. Part of her wanted to believe. Another part screamed at her not to fall into the trap of needing someone again. She snapped the notebook shut, pressing it to her chest. "Even if I wanted to, Rosie's manager will never allow it. He already hates when I stand still for more than a minute." Almost as if summoned, the manager barked across the diner. "Harper, quit sitting around and get back to work." Her cheeks flushed. She stood clutching the notebook and whispered to David, "See, this world doesn't have room for dreams." But she didn't give the notebook back. By the end of the week, Sarah carried her mother's notebook everywhere, tucked safely in her apron. In the quiet between orders, she'd steal glances at the pages, the sketches of shelves and a coffee jar. her mother's neat handwriting spelling out Linda's place. It gave her hope, but it also scared her. Dreams had never lasted long in her world. One evening, when the rush had slowed, David slid into his usual booth. Sarah hesitated, then sat across from him, clutching the notebook like a shield. She really believed this could work, Sarah said softly, almost to herself. She wanted people to have a place to belong, even if all they could afford was a cup of coffee. David nodded. Then let's try it. A pay-it-forward corner here at Rosie's. Small, simple, but real. Before Sarah could answer, the manager strode over, his face set in a scowl. "What's this?" he demanded, eyeing the notebook between them. Sarah's voice wavered but held steady. "It's an idea. A pay-it-forward coffee jar. People can put in $1 so the next person drinks free. My mum dreamed of something like it." The manager snorted. "This is a diner, not a charity. Customers pay for what they order. I don't run a soup kitchen." David's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting Sarah decide. Her chest rose and fell as she gripped the notebook tighter. "It wouldn't cost you anything. People want to help if you let them, and it might even bring more business." The manager shook his head. "I said no. End of discussion. Now get back to work before I cut your hours." Sarah's cheeks burned. For years she had swallowed words like these, bowing her head to keep her job, to keep food on the table. But tonight, with her daughter's future hanging by a thread and her mother's dream pressed against her chest, something inside her shifted. She stood straighter, her voice steady. "You can cut my hours if you want, but I'm going to try this, with or without your permission." The manager's eyes narrowed, his tone cold. "Then you'd better hope your little charity stunt doesn't drag this place down. 30 days, if it fails, it's gone. And maybe so are you." He turned and stomped back behind the counter, muttering under his breath. Sarah sat back down, her hands trembling, but for once it wasn't from fear, it was from resolve. David gave her a look of quiet pride. "That was your mother's strength. You just spoke with her voice." Sarah pressed the notebook to her chest, her heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was daring to fight. The first weekend of Linda's place was shaky at best. A mason jar sat at the end of the counter with a handwritten sign, "Pay it forward coffee." Some customers smiled and dropped in a few coins, but others scoffed. A man in a work jacket muttered loud enough for Sarah to hear, "Charity doesn't belong in a diner." By Tuesday night, the jar was nearly empty. Sarah stood behind the counter staring at it, doubt clawing at her chest. Maybe the manager was right. Maybe she had been foolish to think a dream scribbled in her mother's notebook could stand against the hard math of bills and rent. David noticed her quiet despair as he slid into his booth. "Dreams take time," he said gently. Sarah shook her head. "Time is the one thing I don't have. I'm out of this apartment in 3 days." Her voice broke. "And I dragged my mother's name into something that's about to collapse." But the very next night, something shifted. A trucker who came through once a week dropped a 20 into the jar and told Sarah, "My dad always said, leave the world better than you found it." A teacher from the local school added a 5, saying it was for the kids who came in after practice. A church group started showing up on Fridays, each person putting in what they could. The jar filled faster than she could count it. By the end of the month, Rosie's was busier than anyone could remember. People weren't just buying coffee, they were buying into the idea that kindness mattered. Even the manager, who had rolled his eyes at first, found himself bragging to friends about the special corner in his diner. One evening, when the rush had calmed, Sarah carefully placed her mother's ring inside a small display case near the register. Beneath it she taped a note that read, "For every promise kept, for every life remembered." She stood there a moment, her eyes shining, before turning to David. He had shed his polished coat, sleeves rolled, looking more like a man who belonged in a diner than a billionaire. "She'd be proud," he said softly. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. "Not just of me, of us, of everyone who made this happen." Emma toddled over, tugging at David's sleeve. "Grandpa," she said, the word rolling off her tongue without hesitation. David froze for a moment, then his face broke into a smile so full it softened years of grief. He scooped her up, holding her close. The ring on his finger caught the diner's warm light, glinting against the glass case where Linda's ring rested. 2 rings, 2 promises, one made in the past, one kept in the present. For the first time in a long time, David felt the weight lift. Not gone, but transformed. He had finally honoured the woman who saved him, not with money, but with a legacy that belonged to everyone. And as Sarah wiped down the counter, Emma giggling in David's arms, the diner buzzed with laughter and warmth. In that small corner of the world, a broken family had been pieced back together. Not perfectly, but beautifully. Sometimes, the promises we carry are not about money, but about showing up when it matters most. A simple act of listening, a hand held out with respect instead of pity, can change the course of someone's life. Sarah learned that her mother never stopped believing in her, and David discovered that keeping a promise meant giving dignity, not just answers. But here's the question for you. What promise are you carrying right now? One you may have forgotten, but could still keep today. Thank you for spending this time with us. We hope this story touched your heart. See you in the next video, right here on Rain Inside.